He was not a Canadian citizen, but he became the deadliest sniper of the First World War, credited with 378 kills, and the country that refused to recognize him as one of its own would pin 3 medals on his chest. November 6, 1917, Passchendaele, Belgium. The mud stretches in every direction, a gray sea broken only by the dark circles of flooded shell craters. The bodies of soldiers from a dozen failed assaults lie scattered across the wasteland, half swallowed by the earth. In the darkness before dawn, a figure moves between the craters, his boots sucking at the muck with every step. Corporal Francis Pegahmagabow checks the bolt on his Ross rifle and pauses, one hand briefly touching the small leather pouch hanging at his chest. Behind him, the first shells of the creeping barrage begin to fall. The assault on Passchendaele village is about to begin. But to understand how an Ojibwe sniper came to stand in this nightmare, we must go back 3 years and 4,000 miles to the shores of Georgian Bay. Francis Pegahmagabow was born on March 9, 1889, at what is now Shawanaga First Nation on the eastern shore of Georgian Bay in Ontario. He was Ojibwe, a member of the Caribou clan, and part of the Wasauksing First Nation. His father, Michael, died when Francis was only 3 years old. His mother, overwhelmed by illness, returned to her home in the Henvey Inlet First Nation and left her son behind. The boy was raised by an elder named Noah Nebimaniquad, who had also raised his father before him. In Ojibwe, the child was given the name Binaswi, which means the wind that blows off. Nebimaniquad raised the boy in the old ways. Francis learned to hunt and fish in the forests and waters around Georgian Bay. He learned to track game through the bush, to move silently, to wait with patience for the perfect shot. His foster mother taught him traditional medicine. He grew up practicing both Anishinaabe spirituality and Roman Catholicism, moving between 2 worlds as naturally as breathing. At 12 years old, Pegahmagabow left school and went to work in the lumber camps that dotted the region. He worked fishing stations during the season and eventually became a marine fireman on the Great Lakes, tending the engines of ships that carried timber and ore across the inland seas. At 21, he learned to read and write English, a rare skill for a man of his generation and background. He was intelligent, capable, and ambitious. He was also, in the eyes of the Canadian government, not a citizen. Under the Indian Act of 1876, Indigenous people in Canada were classified as wards of the state. They could not vote. They could not leave their reserves without permission from a government-appointed Indian agent. Every aspect of their lives, from education to employment to family matters, was subject to bureaucratic control. When war broke out in Europe in August 1914, the Canadian government actively discouraged Indigenous people from enlisting. The official position was that this was a white man's war. Francis Pegahmagabow did not care what the government thought. On August 13, 1914, 10 days after Britain declared war on Germany, he volunteered for service with the Canadian Expeditionary Force. He was among the very first Canadians to enlist. The editor of the Parry Sound North Star newspaper noted his enlistment with surprise and wrote that Pegahmagabow's grandfather had been a warrior-in-chief who fought for the British in 1812. The boy comes by his fighting instincts from a long line of ancestors, the editor wrote. We are all hoping Francis will distinguish himself as his forefathers did and will return home covered with glory and medals. Before he left for training, Pegahmagabow visited an Ojibwe camp on Lake Superior. There, an old man recognized him and pressed a small leather pouch into his hands. It was a medicine bag, a sacred object in Ojibwe tradition. Such pouches typically contain tobacco and other items of spiritual significance, things meant to protect and guide the owner through danger. The elder told Pegahmagabow that he would shortly go into great danger and that the pouch would keep him safe. Pegahmagabow carried that pouch with him for the next 4 years. He was assigned to the 23rd Regiment, known as the Northern Pioneers, and soon transferred to the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion of the 1st Canadian Division. In October 1914, 20,000 men of the 1st Contingent sailed for England. By February 1915, Pegahmagabow was in France. The fighting came quickly. In April 1915, the 1st Canadian Division was positioned in the Ypres salient in Belgium when the Germans launched the Second Battle of Ypres. On April 22nd, the Germans unleashed a new weapon on the Western Front. Nearly 6,000 canisters released clouds of chlorine gas that drifted across the battlefield on the wind, settling into the trenches and filling them with poison. 2 French divisions broke and fled. The Canadians held their ground. Pegahmagabow was there. Half his battalion was wiped out in the gas attack and the fighting that followed. He survived. He breathed in the chlorine and felt it burn his lungs, damage that would never fully heal. But he kept fighting, kept carrying messages between positions under fire, kept crawling into the deadly space between the trenches that soldiers called no man's land. It was during these early battles that he began to establish his reputation as a sniper. His weapon was the Ross rifle, a Canadian-designed firearm that would become one of the most controversial weapons of the war. The Ross was despised by infantry soldiers. It was beautifully made but too finely tooled for the brutal conditions of trench warfare. In the mud of the Western Front, it jammed constantly. The bolts sometimes failed to lock properly. Soldiers called it the Canadian Club and threw their Ross rifles away at the first opportunity, picking up British Lee Enfields from fallen allies instead. By 1916, the Ross would be officially withdrawn from infantry service. But snipers loved it. The same precision engineering that made it unreliable for rapid fire made it superbly accurate for single-aimed shots. In the hands of a patient marksman who kept his weapon clean and fired only when the moment was right, the Ross rifle was deadly at ranges that made other weapons useless. For Francis Pegahmagabow, the hunter from Georgian Bay, the Ross was the perfect tool. He developed his own methods. At night, he would slip over the parapet of the trench and crawl into no man's land, moving past the barbed wire and the bodies and the flooded shell craters. He would find a concealed position, sometimes a crater, sometimes behind debris or ruins, and settle in to wait. He could wait for hours. He could wait for days if necessary. When a German soldier appeared in his sights, he fired once and then slipped away like smoke, like wind, like a ghost. His fellow soldiers called him Peggy. They learned to trust his iron nerves and superb marksmanship. His first military medal came in 1916 for his work as a messenger and scout during the fighting at Ypres, Festubert, and Givenchy. The official commendation read that he had carried messages with great bravery and success during the whole of the actions and had consistently shown a disregard for danger and faithfulness to duty. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Albert Creighton, had actually nominated him for the Distinguished Conduct Medal, a higher honor. It was downgraded. In 1916, Pegahmagabow fought at the Battle of the Somme, the bloodbath that the Germans called Das Blutbad. He was shot in the left leg and briefly evacuated, but he recovered and returned to the line in time to rejoin his unit as they moved to Belgium. By 1917, he had been promoted to corporal. His kill count was growing. He was becoming known throughout the Canadian Corps as one of the most effective snipers in the entire war. Meanwhile, the war in Flanders was grinding toward its most infamous chapter. On July 31st, 1917, the British launched the Third Battle of Ypres. The objective was to capture the high ground around Passchendaele Ridge and threaten the German submarine bases on the Belgian coast. The offensive was supposed to deliver a decisive blow to the German army. Instead, it delivered months of rain, mud, and mass slaughter. By October, the British, Australian, and New Zealand forces were exhausted. Passchendaele Ridge remained in German hands. The battlefield had been transformed by relentless shelling and endless rain into a swamp where men drowned standing up. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, the commander-in-chief of the British Expeditionary Force, desperately needed a symbolic victory to salvage the campaign and silence his critics in London. He called on the Canadian Corps. Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Currie, the commander of the Canadian Corps, inspected the battlefield and was shocked by what he saw. He told Haig he did not want to commit his men to this attack. It could not be won, he argued, without a terrible expenditure of lives. Haig insisted. The attack would proceed. Currie demanded conditions. He would have full control over planning and timing. He would receive additional artillery support. He would have time to prepare his men in the battlefield. Haig agreed to all of it. And then Currie made his calculation. He told Haig to expect 16,000 Canadian casualties. On October 18th, the Canadian Corps moved into the Ypres salient to relieve the exhausted Australian and New Zealand troops. They had 14 days to prepare for an assault that the British had failed to achieve in 3 months. On October 26th, the Canadian attack began. For the next 11 days, the Corps would claw its way through the mud toward Passchendaele. On November 6th, it would be the 1st Battalion's turn to advance. And Corporal Pegahmagabow would face the worst night of the war. When the Canadians arrived at Passchendaele in mid-October, they found a landscape that defied description. This was not a battlefield. It was the surface of some alien world, a moonscape of destruction that stretched to every horizon. The ground had been churned by months of artillery bombardment until no trace of the original terrain remained. Where there had once been farms and villages and woods, there was now only mud, an endless gray sea of it, broken by the dark circles of water-filled shell craters. The craters were everywhere. Some were small enough to step over. Others were vast pools 20 feet across, deep enough to swallow a man completely. They were filled with foul water, a mix of rain and groundwater and things no soldier wanted to think about. The bodies of men who had fallen in previous attacks floated in, some of them, British and Australian and New Zealand, dead, their uniforms rotting, their faces unrecognizable. The smell hung over everything. The sweet, sick stench of decay mixed with the chemical tang of explosive residue and poison gas. The village of Passchendaele itself no longer existed. It had been obliterated so completely that it was nothing more than a name on a map, a point of reference marking a patch of rubble indistinguishable from any other patch of rubble. The Germans held the ridge beyond it, and from that high ground they could observe everything the Allies did. Their artillery had clear sight lines across the entire battlefield. Any movement during daylight invited a barrage. The mud was the true enemy. In places it was ankle deep, in others it reached to a man's waist. Soldiers who stepped off the narrow duckboard paths that engineers had laid across the swamp simply disappeared, sucked down into the muck, drowning in filth within sight of their comrades. Stretcher bearers trying to evacuate the wounded sometimes took 8 hours to carry a single man back to the aid stations, crawling on hands and knees through mud that grabbed at them with every movement. Many wounded men drowned in shell craters before anyone could reach them. Their cries could be heard across no man's land, growing weaker through the night until they finally stopped. Lieutenant General Currie surveyed this nightmare and reportedly told his staff that it was not worth a single drop of blood. But orders were orders, and the Canadians were soldiers. They would attack. Unlike the British commanders who had preceded him, Currie refused to send his men forward without proper preparation. He demanded 14 days before the assault, and he used every hour of that time. His plan called for a series of 4 carefully staged attacks spread over 2 weeks, each designed to capture limited objectives and then consolidate before moving on. This was the bite-and-hold approach that had served the Canadians well at Vimy Ridge earlier that year. They would take ground in pieces, dig in, repel the inevitable German counterattacks, and only then advance again. The engineering effort required to make this possible was staggering. Canadian engineers and pioneer battalions worked around the clock, often under German artillery fire, to build the infrastructure of attack. They laid hundreds of meters of duckboard paths across the swamp, creating walkable routes where none had existed. They built and repaired roads and tram lines to bring ammunition and supplies forward. They constructed gun emplacements for the artillery that would support the infantry advance. They moved hundreds of thousands of artillery shells to the front, a task that required thousands of horses and mules, many of which died in the effort, their bodies left to sink into the mud alongside the human dead. All of this work was done under constant observation from the German positions on the ridge. The German artillery fired continuously on the Canadian preparations, killing and wounding hundreds of men before the attack even began. Simply being in the Passchendaele sector was lethal. The Canadians paid in blood for every meter of road they laid and every gun emplacement they dug. On October 26th, the first phase of the attack began. At 5:40 in the morning, the 3rd and 4th Canadian Divisions rose from their shell holes and advanced behind a creeping barrage, a wall of artillery fire that moved forward at a predetermined pace, theoretically destroying German positions just ahead of the advancing infantry. The soldiers followed the barrage as closely as they dared, trying to reach the German trenches before the defenders could recover from the shelling. The mud made everything harder. Men sank to their knees, their waists, sometimes their chests. Rifles became clogged with filth and refused to fire. Units that had started the advance in neat formations quickly became scattered. Small groups of soldiers struggling forward independently, losing contact with the men on either side of them. Communications broke down almost immediately. Runners carrying messages between units had to navigate the same impossible terrain as everyone else, and many of them never arrived. Despite everything, the Canadians made progress. By October 27th, they had captured Bellevue Spur, one of their initial objectives. The cost was heavy. Casualties mounted with every hour. The second phase came on October 30th, with the 3rd and 4th Divisions attacking again. The gains were smaller this time, the German resistance fiercer. The creeping barrage was less effective on the churned and cratered ground, and the Germans had learned to shelter in their concrete pillboxes until the shelling passed. More Canadians died. The line crept forward. Then came a moment of dark comedy that underlined the chaos of the battlefield. A Canadian soldier, disoriented in the featureless waste, accidentally wandered into German lines and was captured. Under interrogation, he revealed the date of the next major assault. The Germans now knew exactly when the Canadians would attack. It made no difference. The weight of Canadian artillery was simply too great. Even knowing when the blow would fall, the Germans could not stop it. As November began, the 3rd and 4th Divisions were exhausted. They had been fighting and dying in the mud for nearly 2 weeks. Now the 1st and 2nd Divisions moved into the line to take over, fresh troops for the final push to capture the village itself. Among them was Corporal Francis Pegahmagabow and the 1st Battalion. The night of November 5th found them huddled in waterlogged shell holes that served as their positions. There was no continuous trench line here, just a series of craters connected by flooded paths, each hole holding a handful of soldiers trying to stay alive until dawn. Rain fell steadily. German artillery shells burst at random intervals, their explosions muffled by the soft ground but still lethal to anyone caught in the open. Sleep was impossible. Staying dry was impossible. The men could only wait. Pegahmagabow's role in the coming attack would be different from his usual work as a sniper. The assault would require coordination between units advancing across a landscape where visibility was nearly zero and communications were unreliable at best. Someone would need to move between the flanking units, maintaining contact, reporting positions, ensuring that the different elements of the attack did not lose touch with each other, and create gaps in the line that the Germans could exploit. Someone would need to guide reinforcements forward through terrain where a wrong turn meant drowning in a shell crater. This required a man who could navigate the worst ground on the Western Front, who could move unseen through fire, who knew how to read terrain and find his way in chaos. It required a scout. It required a sniper. It required Francis Pegahmagabow. In the hours before dawn, he prepared himself as he always did. He checked his Ross rifle, ensuring the bolt moved smoothly and the chamber was clear of mud. He adjusted his equipment, making sure nothing would snag or rattle. And in the darkness, he touched the small leather pouch at his chest, the medicine bag that an elder had given him 3 years earlier, with the promise that it would keep him safe. The elder had told him he would go into great danger. The artillery began at 6 in the morning. The barrage was immense, hundreds of guns firing simultaneously, their shells tearing into the German positions on the ridge. The ground shook. the air filled with smoke and dust and the howl of incoming rounds. And across the devastated landscape, the men of the 1st and 2nd Canadian Divisions began to climb out of their holes and move forward into the fire. The creeping barrage rolled forward across the battlefield like a moving wall of fire. Canadian artillery had been pounding the German positions for days, but this was different. A concentrated fury designed to tear apart the defenses immediately ahead of the advancing infantry. The shells fell in a line that crept steadily toward the German trenches, and the soldiers of the 1st and 2nd Canadian Divisions followed it as closely as they dared, sometimes within 50 meters of the explosions, trusting that the gunners would not drop short and kill them. The Germans, despite their advance warning of the attack, were caught off guard by the sheer intensity of the bombardment. Many were still sheltering in their dugouts and concrete pillboxes when the Canadians appeared out of the smoke and mud. The 1st Division, under Major General Sir Archibald Cameron MacDonald, attacked on the left flank, pushing toward the hamlet of Mosselmart. The 2nd Division drove straight for what remained of Passchendaele village. The creeping barrage had done its work. The initial resistance was lighter than expected. But the advantage lasted only minutes. As soon as the Canadians moved beyond the barrage, the chaos began. The mud slowed everything. Men who had trained to advance at a steady walking pace found themselves struggling to move at all, their boots sinking deep with every step, their legs burning with the effort of pulling free. Units that had started the attack in formation quickly broke apart into scattered groups, each cluster of soldiers fighting their own private war against the ground and the enemy. Visibility dropped to almost nothing as smoke from the barrage mixed with the mist rising from the waterlogged craters. Within the first hour, most commanders had lost contact with the units on either side of them. The Germans recovered quickly. Machine gun fire began to sweep across the battlefield from pillboxes that had survived the bombardment, their concrete walls proof against anything but a direct hit. Soldiers caught in the open went down in rows. Those who reached cover found themselves pinned in shell craters, unable to advance or retreat, the mud trapping them as effectively as any barbed wire. The 27th Battalion, known as the City of Winnipeg Battalion, led the assault on the village itself. What they found was barely recognizable as a place where human beings had once lived. Passchendaele was rubble, a jumble of broken stone and shattered timber and churned earth. The cellars of destroyed buildings had been converted into machine gun nests. Every pile of debris might conceal a German rifleman. The fighting became close and brutal. The kind of combat where grenades and bayonets mattered more than rifles, where men killed each other at distances measured in feet rather than yards. Individual acts of extraordinary courage became commonplace. Private Colin Fraser Barron of Toronto attacked a machine gun nest that was holding up his unit's advance. He killed the crew, seized the weapon, and turned it on the retreating Germans. Sergeant George Mullen charged a pillbox single-handed, crawling through the mud under fire, and knocked it out with grenades. Private James Peter Robertson of Nova Scotia rushed a machine gun position alone, killed the crew in hand-to-hand fighting, and then used the captured weapon to cover his comrades, advance until he was killed by a sniper. 9 Canadians would receive the Victoria Cross for their actions at Passchendaele. On this single day, heroism that would have been legendary in any other battle became almost routine. By afternoon, the village was in Canadian hands. But holding the village meant nothing if the flanks collapsed. The 1st Battalion was fighting on the left of the Canadian line, advancing alongside the rest of the 1st Division toward objectives beyond the village. The terrain here was no better than anywhere else, a wasteland of craters and mud, and the debris of 3 months of failed attacks. As the battalion pushed forward, the men on either end of the line began to lose contact with the units beside them. In the smoke and confusion, it was impossible to know where friendly forces ended and the enemy began. This was where Corporal Francis Pegahmagabow went to work. He moved between positions under fire, crawling through the mud that had swallowed so many others, using every skill he had learned in 3 years of sniping and scouting. His job was to find the units on the flanks, to see them and report their positions, to ensure that the commanders knew where their men were and where the gaps in the line might be. In a battle where communications had broken down almost completely, a single man who could move unseen across the battlefield and bring back accurate information was worth more than a company of riflemen. He found that the flanking units had become separated from the main advance. The mud and the enemy fire had slowed them, and in the murk they had drifted off course. Gaps were opening in the Canadian line, spaces where German counterattacks could drive through and roll up the entire position. Pegahmagabow reported what he had seen, allowing the commanders to adjust their dispositions and close the gaps before the Germans could exploit them. But his most critical work came as night fell. A relief force was moving forward to reinforce the Canadian positions, fresh troops meant to help hold the ground that had been won during the day. In any normal battle, this would have been a straightforward operation, units moving up established routes to take over from exhausted comrades. At Passchendaele, nothing was straightforward. The reinforcements became lost. In the featureless moonscape of mud and craters, with no landmarks and no visible trench lines, they could not find their assigned positions. They were wandering somewhere in the darkness, exposed to German artillery fire that was now pounding the Canadian gains, unable to locate the men they were supposed to relieve. If they remained lost, they would either be killed by shells or would fail to reach the line in time to repel the counterattacks that would surely come at dawn. Pegahmagabow found them. Moving through the darkness, navigating by instinct and experience across ground that killed men who made a single wrong step, he located the lost reinforcements and guided them to their correct positions. He led them through the maze of craters and corpses, past the flooded holes where wounded men still cried for help, to the shell holes and scrapes in the mud where the 1st Battalion was digging in for the night. Without him, they would have remained lost until the Germans found them. With him, they reached the line and took their places in time to face what was coming. The fighting did not stop when darkness fell. German artillery pounded the Canadian positions throughout the night, shells bursting in the mud with flashes of orange light, shrapnel singing through the air. German infantry probed the line, looking for weak points, launching local counterattacks that had to be beaten back with rifle fire and grenades. The Canadians huddled in their holes, wet and freezing and exhausted, and held on. By morning on November 7th, the objectives for the previous day were secure. The village of Passchendaele, or the ground where it had once stood, was in Canadian hands. The 1st Division had reached its targets on the left flank. The gaps in the line had been closed, the reinforcements were in position, and the German counterattacks had been repulsed. The official citation for Corporal Francis Pegahmagabow's first bar to his military medal would read as follows. At Passchendaele, November 6th and 7th, 1917, this NCO did excellent work. Before and after the attack, he kept in touch with the flanks, advising the units he had seen, this information proving the success of the attack and saving valuable time in consolidating. He also guided the relief to its proper place after it had become mixed up. The words were dry and bureaucratic, the language of official reports. They did not capture what it meant to move across that ground in darkness under fire. They did not convey the skill required to navigate a landscape that had killed thousands. They did not explain that the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history had earned his medal not by killing, but by saving, not by taking lives, but by guiding lost men home. 4 days later, on November 10th, the Canadians launched the final phase of the attack. They pushed 900 meters north from the village to capture the crest of Passchendaele Ridge. The resistance was lighter than expected. The Germans had been bled white by the fighting and had little left to give. By the end of the day, the ridge was in Canadian hands. The Third Battle of Ypres was over. The Canadians had succeeded where the British and the Australians and the New Zealanders had failed. They had taken Passchendaele. Now came the counting. The guns fell silent on November 10th, and the Canadians looked around at what they had won. The ridge was theirs. The village, or the heap of rubble that bore its name, was theirs. The high ground that the British had been trying to capture since July was finally in Allied hands. It had taken the Canadian Corps 16 days to accomplish what 3 months of British attacks had failed to achieve. The cost was written in the mud. Canadian casualties at Passchendaele totaled 15,654 men. More than 4,000 of them were dead. The rest were wounded, many grievously, their bodies torn by shrapnel and bullets, their lungs burned by gas, their minds shattered by the relentless horror of the fighting. Lieutenant General Currie had predicted 16,000 casualties before the battle began. His estimate had been almost exactly correct, a grim testament to his understanding of what the attack would require. Many of the wounded never made it off the battlefield. Stretcher bearers struggled for hours to carry single casualties through the waist-deep mud, and for some, the help came too late. Men who had survived their initial wounds drowned in shell craters before anyone could reach them. Their bodies joined the thousands of others already rotting in the swamp, British and Australian and New Zealand dead from the earlier phases of the offensive, Germans killed in the bombardments and the close fighting. The battlefield was a graveyard that stretched for miles in every direction. The total cost of the Third Battle of Ypres was staggering. Allied casualties reached approximately 275,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. German losses were estimated at 220,000. 500,000 men had fallen for a few miles of Belgian mud. 9 Canadians received the Victoria Cross for their actions at Passchendaele, the highest award for valor in the British Empire. Corporal Francis Pegahmagabow received the first bar to his military medal. He had survived again. The medicine pouch still hung at his chest. His lungs, damaged by the gas at Second Ypres 2 years earlier, were growing worse with each passing month. But he was alive, and he could still fight. The strategic value of the victory was questionable even at the time. The Canadians had captured the ridge and denied the Germans their observation posts over the Ypres salient, but the hoped-for breakthrough to the Belgian coast had never materialized. The submarine bases that had been one of the original objectives remained in German hands. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George would later call Passchendaele one of the greatest disasters of the war and condemn the senseless campaign that had produced nothing but mass slaughter. The final irony would come the following spring. In March 1918, the Germans launched their Great Spring Offensive, a last desperate gamble to win the war before American reinforcements could tip the balance. The attack smashed through the Allied lines in several sectors, and commanders were forced to make brutal choices about what ground to hold and what ground to abandon. Passchendaele was abandoned. All of it, every meter of mud that the Canadians had paid for in blood, was given up without a fight, evacuated to shorten the defensive line. The ridge that had cost 16,000 Canadian casualties was surrendered in a single day. The bodies of the dead remained where they had fallen, now in German-held territory once again. For the men who had survived the battle, there was no time to contemplate the futility. The war continued. Francis Pegahmagabow remained with the 1st Battalion through the dark months of early 1918, when the German offensives threatened to break the Allied armies entirely. He survived the desperate defensive fighting of the spring and was still serving when the tide turned in August and the Allies launched their final offensive, the campaign that would become known as the 100 Days. On August 30th, 1918, Pegahmagabow found himself at Oryx Trench near Upton Wood during the Battle of the Scarpe. His company was in serious trouble. German counterattacks had pinned them down, and they were running out of ammunition. Without resupply, they would be overwhelmed. The Germans were pressing hard, sensing weakness, and the line was in danger of collapsing. Pegahmagabow did what he had always done. He went over the top. Under heavy machine gun and rifle fire, he crossed the open ground of no man's land, found the ammunition his company needed, and brought it back. It was the kind of action that killed most men who attempted it, a sprint through a storm of bullets with no cover and no support. He made it. His company held. The German counterattacks were repulsed. For this action, Pegahmagabow received the 2nd bar to his military medal. He was now one of only 38 or 39 Canadians to have received the military medal with 2 bars, one of the most exclusive distinctions in the Canadian military. He was the most highly decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history. By the time the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, he was credited with 378 kills as a sniper and the capture of more than 300 German prisoners. The numbers were extraordinary, but they came with a caveat that Pegahmagabow himself would never have mentioned. Unlike many snipers, he worked alone, without a spotter to verify his kills. The 378 figure was based on his own reports and the observations of his comrades, not on the kind of rigorous confirmation that military record keepers preferred. Some historians have questioned whether the number can be taken as precise. What cannot be questioned is his reputation. His battalion knew what he was capable of. His commanders knew. The men who served beside him knew. He had spent 4 years doing the most dangerous work the war had to offer, crawling into no man's land night after night, waiting for hours in shell craters for a single shot, carrying messages through barrages, guiding lost men through the dark. He had survived the gas at Second Ypres and the slaughter of the Somme and the nightmare of Passchendaele. He had been wounded and returned. He had been recommended for higher honors and seen them downgraded. Through it all, he had never stopped fighting. He never talked about it. His son Duncan would later say that he learned about his father's capture of 300 prisoners from other people, not from Francis himself. The family knew he had been a soldier and that he had won medals, but the details of what he had done remained locked away. The sniper's silence extended into civilian life. Whatever memories he carried, whatever weight those 378 deaths placed on his soul, he kept to himself. In April 1919, Pegahmagabow was invalided back to Canada. His war was finally over. He had served for nearly the entire conflict, from the first contingent in 1914 to the armistice in 1918, one of the rare soldiers who had survived from beginning to end. He brought home the medicine pouch that had protected him, the Ross rifle skills that had made him legendary, and the damaged lungs that would slowly kill him over the next 3 decades. On August 27, 1919, he stood before a crowd of more than 50,000 people at the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto. Edward, Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, was presenting medals to returned soldiers, 200 veterans receiving their decorations that day. When Pegahmagabow's turn came, the prince pinned the military medal and its 2 bars to his chest, the physical symbols of everything he had done and endured. It should have been a moment of triumph. It should have marked his entry into Canadian society as a hero, a man who had proven his worth on the battlefields of Europe and earned the respect of his nation. Instead, it marked the beginning of a different kind of war. Because when Francis Pegahmagabow stepped off that stage, he was still not a Canadian citizen. Under the Indian Act, he remained a ward of the state, his life controlled by government bureaucrats, his rights denied, his sacrifices officially meaningless in the eyes of the law. He had won 3 medals, fighting for a country that did not consider him worthy of voting in its elections. The biographer Adrian Hayes would later summarize his situation with brutal clarity. When he was in uniform, he was considered an equal by what he could do. When he came back, he just went back to being an Indian. The war in Europe was over. The Second War was about to begin. Francis Pegahmagabow spent the rest of his life fighting. He was elected chief of the Wasauksing First Nation and clashed constantly with the Indian agents who controlled every aspect of reserve life. They called him a mental case, a troublemaker, a man who refused to accept his place. He called himself a warrior for his people's rights. In 1943, he helped found the Brotherhood of Canadian Indians, one of the first national Indigenous organizations. In 1945, he was elected Supreme Chief of the Native Independent Government, a precursor to the Assembly of First Nations. The gas never stopped killing him. By the 1950s, his lungs were so damaged that he had to sleep sitting upright to keep them from filling with fluid. On August 5, 1952, his heart gave out. He was 61 years old. Today, a bronze statue stands in Parry Sound, overlooking Georgian Bay. It shows a soldier with a Ross rifle slung over his shoulder, an eagle on his arm, a caribou at his feet. The ghost in the trenches finally has a face. But the real monument is simpler. Francis Pegahmagabow fought 2 wars, one in the mud of Passchendaele and one in the halls of power, and he never surrendered in either. He was a warrior to the end.